Sarah Collins stood frozen in the doorway of her mother-in-law's Victorian-style kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting dappled shadows across the gleaming countertops and antique cabinets. But it was the scene unfolding before her that held Sarah's attention in a vice-like grip. Margaret Collins, her husband's mother, stood with her back to the door, hunched over two delicate porcelain teacups. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in its usual tight bun, and her floral house dress hung loosely on her thin frame. To anyone else, it might have looked like a grandmother preparing a cozy afternoon tea. But Sarah knew better. With trembling hands, Margaret reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a small vial. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched her mother-in-law unscrew the cap and tilt the vial over one of the cups. A fine white powder trickled into the steaming liquid. "What are you doing?" The words tumbled from Sarah's lips before she could stop them. Margaret whirled around, her face a mask of shock and guilt. The vial disappeared into her pocket with lightning speed. "Sarah, I didn't hear you come in." Her voice was shrill, nothing like her usual calm demeanor. Sarah's mind raced. She and Margaret had never seen eye to eye, but this? This was beyond anything she could have imagined. "I asked what you're doing," she repeated, her voice steadier now as anger began to replace her initial shock. Margaret's eyes darted to the teacups, then back to Sarah. "Just preparing our afternoon tea, dear. Nothing more." The lie hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah stepped fully into the kitchen, her legs feeling like lead. She glanced at the two cups, identical in every way, save for the secret ingredient Margaret had added to one. "Which cup are you planning to give me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. A tense silence stretched between them. Margaret's fingers fidgeted with the frayed edge of her apron. "I don't know what you mean," she said finally, but her voice wavered. In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She strode forward, brushing past her stunned mother-in-law. With deliberate movements, she picked up both cups and turned her back to Margaret. Her hands moved swiftly, switching the positions of the cups. When she turned back, her face was a mask of calm. "You're right," Sarah said, her voice sickly sweet. "It's time for our tea." She held out one of the cups to Margaret. "Here's yours." Margaret's face paled. Her hands shook as she reached for the cup, hesitating for a long moment before taking it. Sarah watched as uncertainty and fear flickered across her mother-in-law's features. "Shall we sit?" Sarah gestured to the small table by the window, where they usually had their afternoon talks, conversations that had grown increasingly strained over the past few months. Margaret nodded mutely, following Sarah to the table. They sat across from each other, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging between them. Sarah raised her cup, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "To family," she said, her tone laced with irony. Margaret's cup clinked against the saucer as her hand trembled. "To family," she echoed weakly. Sarah took a sip of her tea, the warm liquid sliding down her throat. She watched as Margaret stared into her own cup, conflict etched into every line of her face. "Is something wrong?" Sarah asked innocently. "You usually enjoy your tea so much." Margaret's eyes snapped up to meet Sarah's. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, a realization that their relationship had crossed a line from which there was no return. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4, Sarah knew that the events of this afternoon would change everything. The question was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? She took another sip of her tea and waited. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the kitchen, each second stretching into eternity. Sarah watched as Margaret's fingers tightened around her teacup, knuckles whitening with the strain. The older woman's eyes darted between her untouched tea and Sarah's face, a war of emotions playing out across her features. "Aren't you going to drink?" Sarah asked, her voice deceptively light. She took another sip from her own cup, savoring the bitter taste of Earl Grey on her tongue. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. I'm not as thirsty as I thought," she said, attempting a weak smile. Sarah set her cup down with a soft clink. "That's unlike you, Margaret. You always say tea is the perfect remedy for any ailment." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or is it only a remedy when someone else is drinking it?" The color drained from Margaret's face. "I don't know what you're implying, but—" "Oh, I think you do," Sarah cut her off, all pretense of politeness evaporating. "I saw you, Margaret. I saw what you put in my tea." For a moment, it seemed as though Margaret might continue to deny it. But then her shoulders sagged, defeat written in every line of her body. "You don't understand," she murmured. her eyes fixed on the table. Then explain it to me, Sarah demanded. Explain why my mother-in-law, the woman who's supposed to be family, tried to poison me. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Poison? No, no, you've got it all wrong. She reached across the table as if to grasp Sarah's hand, but Sarah jerked away. Don't touch me, she hissed. Just tell me the truth. For once in your life, Margaret, be honest with me. The older woman seemed to deflate before Sarah's eyes. She looked suddenly frail, nothing like the imperious matriarch who had ruled over family gatherings with an iron fist. It wasn't poison, she said softly. It was it was a sleeping draught. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. Of all the explanations she'd imagined, this wasn't one of them. A sleeping draught? Why? Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. Because I needed to talk to David without you interfering. I needed to make him see reason. David? My husband? Your son? Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. What does he have to do with this? Everything, Margaret exclaimed, a hint of her old fire returning. He's throwing away everything his father and I worked for, and it's all because of you. The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah felt as though she'd been slapped. What are you talking about? Margaret's eyes blazed with a mixture of anger and desperation. The company, Collins Construction. David's talking about selling it, about moving across the country to start some ridiculous eco-friendly building project. He's willing to toss aside 3 generations of hard work, and for what? Because you filled his head with nonsense about following his dreams. Sarah sat back, stunned. She knew David had been considering making changes to the family business, but she had no idea his mother was so vehemently opposed. That's David's choice to make, not yours, she said firmly. He wouldn't even be considering it if it weren't for your influence, Margaret shot back. I raised him better than that. I just needed a chance to talk to him alone, to remind him of his responsibilities. If you were out of the picture for a few hours. So you decided to drug me? Sarah's voice rose incredulously. Instead of, I don't know, asking to speak to your son privately like a normal person? Margaret had the grace to look ashamed. I I didn't think you'd allow it. You two are always together, always whispering and planning. I felt like I had no other choice. Sarah shook her head, disgust and pity warring within her. You're wrong, Margaret, about so many things. David is his own man, capable of making his own decisions. And if you'd bothered to actually talk to us, instead of resorting to this, you'd know that we're not planning to abandon the family legacy. We want to evolve it, to make it something that can thrive in the future. She stood up abruptly, unable to sit across from this woman any longer. I'm going to call David. He needs to know what happened here today. Margaret's face crumpled. Please don't. He'll never forgive me. Sarah paused at the kitchen door, looking back at the defeated figure of her mother-in-law. That's not my decision to make. It's his. Just like the future of Collins Construction is his decision. It's time you understood that. As Sarah left the kitchen to make the most difficult phone call of her life, she couldn't help but wonder how this would change their family dynamic. One thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The chiming of the grandfather clock marked the hour, a solemn reminder that time, like trust once broken, waits for no one. David Collins stared at his phone, his wife's words echoing in his ears long after the call had ended. The bustling noise of the construction site around him faded into the background as he tried to process what he'd just heard. His mother, the woman who had raised him, had attempted to drug his wife. The thought was so outlandish that a part of him wanted to laugh it off as some kind of bizarre joke. But he knew Sarah wouldn't joke about something like this. The tremor in her voice, the mix of anger and hurt in her words, it was all too real. Hey, Dave, we need your input on this blueprint, one of his foremen called out, waving a rolled-up set of plans. David blinked, snapping back to reality. I've got to go, he muttered, already heading for his truck. Family emergency. I'll be back tomorrow. The drive home was a blur. David's mind raced, replaying conversations with his mother over the past few months. Had there been signs he'd missed? Tensions he'd overlooked? He'd known his mother wasn't thrilled about his ideas for the company, but this level of desperation seemed unfathomable. As he pulled into the driveway of the home he shared with Sarah, David took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He found Sarah in the living room, pacing back and forth, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Hey, he said softly, announcing his presence. Sarah turned, relief washing over her face. In 3 quick strides, she was in his arms, burying her face in his chest. "I'm so glad you're home," she murmured. David held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "I came as soon as I could. Are you okay? Did you did you drink any of the tea?" Sarah shook her head, stepping back to look up at him. "No, I switched the cups. Your mother, she didn't drink hers either." A knot of tension David hadn't realized he was carrying loosened slightly. At least no one had actually been drugged. But the intent, that was a whole other issue. "I need to hear everything," he said, leading Sarah to the couch. "From the beginning." As Sarah recounted the afternoon's events, David felt a strange mix of emotions churning inside him. Anger at his mother's actions, fear at what could have happened, and a deep, aching sadness for the fracture this would cause in their family. When Sarah finished, silence fell between them. David ran a hand through his hair, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was stressed. "I can't believe she would do this," he said finally. "I mean, I know she's been unhappy about the changes I want to make to the company, but this is insane." Sarah reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I think it goes deeper than that, David. Your mother seems to believe that I'm some kind of corrupting influence on you, that I'm the reason you want to make changes to Cullen's construction." David snorted, a humorless sound. "That's ridiculous. These ideas have been brewing in my head for years. You've been nothing but supportive." "I know that, and you know that," Sarah said gently. "But your mother, I don't think she sees it that way. In her mind, I'm an outsider threatening the family legacy." David stood up abruptly, anger flaring. "That doesn't give her the right to try and drug you. God, what was she thinking?" Sarah remained seated, her voice calm. "I don't think she was thinking clearly at all. She's scared, David, scared of change, scared of losing control." "That's no excuse," David muttered. But some of the fight went out of him. He sank back down onto the couch, suddenly feeling exhausted. "What do we do now?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think you need to talk to her, alone." David looked at her in surprise. "After what she tried to do to you, Sarah, I can't just—" "You have to," Sarah interrupted firmly. "She's still your mother, David, and as furious as I am with her right now, I don't want to be the reason your relationship is destroyed. You need to hear her side of things, and she needs to understand that her actions have consequences." David marveled at his wife's capacity for empathy, even in the face of such a betrayal. It was one of the many reasons he loved her. "You're right," he said softly. "But what about you? I don't want you to feel unsafe or uncomfortable." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'll be fine. I think I'll go stay with my sister for a few days. Give you and your mom some space to work things out." David nodded, a plan starting to form in his mind. "Okay, I'll call Mom, ask her to come over tomorrow. We'll hash this out once and for all." As they sat there, hands intertwined, both lost in thought about the conversation to come, David couldn't help but wonder how their family would look on the other side of this crisis. Would they be able to rebuild the trust that had been shattered? Or would this be the breaking point that changed everything forever? The setting sun cast long shadows across the living room, a reminder that time was marching on. Tomorrow would bring confrontations and difficult truths. But for now, David held on to Sarah, grateful for her strength and wisdom in the face of adversity. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside the Collins household. David stood at the kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the driveway. Sarah had left an hour ago, her suitcase packed for a few days at her sister's. The goodbye had been bittersweet. David was grateful for her understanding, but her absence left him feeling oddly vulnerable. The crunch of gravel announced his mother's arrival. David's grip tightened on his mug as he watched Margaret's car pull up. She sat there for a long moment after cutting the engine, and even from a distance, David could see the slump of her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, he went to open the front door. Margaret was halfway up the path, her usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. When she looked up and saw David, her face crumpled. "Oh, David," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, David was transported back to his childhood, memories of skinned knees and broken toys, his mother always there with comfort and reassurance. But this wasn't a simple mistake that could be fixed with a bandage or glue. This ran much deeper. "Come inside, Mom," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We need to talk." They settled in the living room, the space between them on the couch feeling like a chasm. Margaret's eyes darted around, taking in the family photos on the walls, Sarah's books on the coffee table. "Where's Sarah?" she asked tentatively. "She's staying with her sister for a few days," David replied. "She thought it would be best if you and I talked alone." Guilt flashed across Margaret's face. "That's very understanding of her." "More understanding than you deserve," David said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "Mom, what were you thinking? Drugging Sarah? Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I was desperate, David. The thought of losing everything your father and I built." "You're not losing anything," David exclaimed, frustration boiling over. "The company isn't going anywhere. I'm trying to ensure its future, not destroy it." "But you talked about selling." "I talked about selling some of our older properties to invest in new, sustainable building techniques," David interrupted. "Mom, the world is changing. If we don't adapt, we'll be left behind. I'm not throwing away our legacy. I'm trying to secure it for the next generation." Margaret fell silent, absorbing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was small. "I suppose I never really listened when you tried to explain before. I was so scared of change that I couldn't see the opportunities." David softened slightly. "Why didn't you just talk to me? Why go to such extremes?" His mother's eyes welled with tears. "I felt like I was losing you. Not just the company, but you. You and Sarah, you're so close, always making plans. I felt left out, obsolete." The admission hung in the air between them. David felt a pang of guilt. Had he really been so wrapped up in his ideas and his relationship with Sarah that he'd neglected his mother? "Mom," he said gently, "you're not obsolete. You'll always be an important part of my life and the company. But you have to understand, Sarah isn't a threat. She supports me, challenges me to be better. She's my partner in every sense of the word." Margaret nodded slowly. "I see that now. I let my fears cloud my judgment, and I've made a terrible mistake." She looked up at David, her eyes pleading. "Do you think Sarah will ever be able to forgive me?" David sighed. "I don't know, Mom. What you did, it's going to take time to rebuild that trust, but I know Sarah. She has a capacity for forgiveness that amazes me. If you're truly sorry, if you're willing to make amends and respect our decisions going forward, then maybe—" "I am," Margaret said quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes. I never want to jeopardize our family like this again." They talked for hours, delving into the plans for the company's future that David had been too hesitant to fully share before. Margaret listened with growing interest, occasionally offering insights from her years of experience. By the time the grandfather clock chimed noon, a tentative peace had been reached. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "David," she said softly, "I truly am sorry. For everything. I hope someday you and Sarah can forgive me." David hugged his mother, feeling the frailty in her frame that he'd never noticed before. "We'll work on it, Mom, together." After Margaret's car disappeared down the street, David picked up his phone to call Sarah. As he waited for her to answer, he reflected on the morning's conversation. They had a long road ahead, rebuilding trust, redefining roles, learning to communicate openly. But for the first time since this ordeal began, David felt a glimmer of hope. Family, he realized, was like the buildings he constructed. With a strong foundation and careful maintenance, it could weather any storm. As Sarah's voice came on the line, David smiled. They had the foundation. Now it was time to start rebuilding. A week had passed since the confrontation between David and his mother. Sarah had returned home, and the house felt whole again, though an undercurrent of tension still lingered in the air. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Sarah broached the subject they'd both been tiptoeing around. "I think it's time we invited your mother over," she said, looking up from her book. David, who had been scrolling through work emails on his tablet, set the device aside. "Are you sure? There's no rush, Sarah. If you need more time—" Sarah shook her head, a determined look in her eyes. "No, I think we've all had enough time to process. If we're going to move forward, we need to face this head on." David marveled at his wife's strength. "Okay," he agreed. "I'll give her a call." The next evening found them all gathered around the dining room table. Margaret had arrived bearing a homemade apple pie, a peace offering of sorts. The aroma of cinnamon and butter filled the air, a comforting scent at odds with the palpable tension. For a while they ate in silence, the clink of cutlery against plates the only sound. Finally, Margaret set down her fork and took a deep breath. "Sarah, David," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "I want to apologize again for my actions. What I did was inexcusable, and I understand if you can never fully trust me again. But I want you both to know how deeply sorry I am." Sarah met Margaret's gaze steadily. "I appreciate your apology, Margaret. What you did was indeed inexcusable, but I'm willing to try and move past it, for David's sake and for the sake of this family." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I promise I'll do everything in my power to earn back your trust." David reached out, taking both his wife's and his mother's hands. "We all made mistakes," he said. "I should have been more open about my plans for the company. Should have made more of an effort to include you, Mom. But that's in the past now. What matters is how we move forward." Sarah nodded. "I agree. And I think the best way to do that is to lay everything out on the table. No more secrets, no more assumptions." For the next few hours, they talked openly about the future of Collins Construction. David outlined his vision for incorporating eco-friendly building practices and expanding into new markets. To his surprise, Margaret listened with genuine interest, even offering suggestions based on her years of experience in the industry. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "your father always said that adaptability was the key to success. I think he'd be proud of the direction you're taking the company, David." The mention of David's late father brought a lump to his throat. "Thanks, Mom. That means a lot." As the evening wore on, the atmosphere gradually lightened. They shared memories of David's childhood, laughed over old family stories, and even began to tentatively plan for the future. By the time Margaret prepared to leave, it felt as though a weight had been lifted. At the door, Margaret hesitated. "I know it will take time," she said softly, "but I hope we can be a real family again." Sarah surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping forward and hugging her mother-in-law. "We already are," she said, a little battered and bruised maybe, but still standing. As they watched Margaret's car disappear down the street, David wrapped an arm around Sarah's waist. "You're amazing, you know that?" he murmured. Sarah leaned into him. "We're amazing, together." That night, as they lay in bed, Sarah turned to David. "I've been thinking," she said, "maybe we should invite your mom to be part of the new eco-friendly initiative. Her experience could be valuable, and it might help her feel more connected to the company's future." David smiled in the darkness. "That's a great idea. We could make it a real family business again." As they drifted off to sleep, both felt a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But they had laid a new foundation, stronger than before, because it was built on honesty and understanding. In the quiet of the night, the Collins house settled around them, a silent witness to the power of forgiveness and the strength of family bonds. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, mother, son, and daughter-in-law, a united front against the storms of life. 6 months had passed since that fateful afternoon in Margaret's kitchen. The seasons had changed, leaves turning from green to gold and then falling away, making room for new growth. In many ways, the Collins family had mirrored this natural cycle of renewal. On a crisp spring morning, David stood on the side of Collins Construction's newest project, their first fully eco-friendly residential development. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as workers bustled about, bringing their vision to life. "It's really coming together, isn't it?" Sarah's voice came from beside him. She had just arrived, thermos of coffee in hand. David smiled, accepting the warm cup she offered. "It is. I can hardly believe we're finally here." As they surveyed the site, a familiar car pulled up. Margaret stepped out, looking more vibrant than she had in years. Her involvement in the eco-friendly initiative had given her a new lease on life, reigniting her passion for the business. "Good morning, you two," she called out cheerfully as she approached. "I hope I'm not late for the meeting." Sarah shook her head, smiling. "Right on time, Margaret. We were just about to head in." The three of them made their way to the temporary office set up on the site. Inside, blueprints and material samples covered every surface. They settled around the table, the atmosphere one of easy camaraderie that would have seemed impossible just months ago. As David began outlining the day's agenda, he couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come. The road to reconciliation hadn't been easy. There had been tense moments, difficult conversations, and times when old resentments threatened to resurface. But with patience, understanding, and a shared commitment to healing, they had slowly rebuilt their relationship stronger than before. Margaret had thrown herself into learning about sustainable building practices, often staying up late to research new technologies. Her enthusiasm had been infectious, inspiring the entire team to push boundaries and think creatively. Sarah, true to her nature, had been the bridge between generations. Her ability to mediate, to find common ground, had been invaluable in smoothing over rough patches. She had also taken on a more active role in the company, her fresh perspective complementing David and Margaret's experience. As the meeting progressed, ideas flowed freely. Margaret suggested incorporating community gardens into the development, while Sarah proposed a partnership with local artisans for interior finishes. David listened, pride swelling in his chest. This was more than he had ever dreamed possible. Not just a successful business, but a true family enterprise. I have an announcement, David said as the meeting drew to a close. Sarah squeezed his hand encouragingly. Sarah and we're expecting. Margaret's eyes widened, a smile blooming on her face. Oh, my dears, that's wonderful news. As Margaret enveloped them both in a hug, David felt a sense of completeness wash over him. This child would be born into a family that had weathered a storm and come out stronger for it. They would grow up seeing the power of forgiveness, the importance of communication, and the strength that comes from working together toward a common goal. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the half-built eco-development in the distance, Sarah turned to David. You know, when I switched those teacups all those months ago, I never imagined we'd end up here. David chuckled softly. Life has a funny way of working out sometimes. That moment could have torn us apart, but instead it forced us to face our problems head on, Sarah finished. It made us stronger. They fell into a comfortable silence, hands intertwined, lost in their own thoughts. The gentle spring breeze carried the promise of new beginnings for their family, for the company, for the community they were building. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The path hadn't been smooth, but every challenge, every difficult conversation, every moment of vulnerability had led them here, to a place of understanding, of growth, of love. In the distance, the lights of the construction site glowed softly, a beacon of progress and unity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But whatever came their way, David knew they would face it, as they had faced everything else, together, as a family. The future stretched out before them, as vast and full of potential as the star-filled sky above. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family and the promise of all that was to come, David Collins knew that they were ready for whatever life had in store.